My name is Sloane Harper, and am 32 years old. The day my father fired me, I stood in his corner office watching him announce my younger sister Bethany as the new CEO of Harper Industries, and I did something nobody expected. I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a sad one, but a genuine, knowing laugh that made my father's face turn red with confusion and anger. Bethany smirked from her leather chair, twirling her perfectly manicured nails, thinking she'd finally won. My father demanded to know what was so funny. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Did you forget, Dad? Did you really forget what I've been doing all these years?" His expression shifted from anger to uncertainty, just for a moment, and that's when I knew he had no idea what was coming. Before we dive into how I made them all regret that decision, I want to hear from all of you watching. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, hit that like button because you're going to love where this story goes. Make sure you subscribe because what happens next is going to show you exactly how karma works when you build your empire right under their noses. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single second of how this unfolds. To understand how we got here, you need to know about the Harper family and the company my father built from absolutely nothing. Richard Harper started Harper Industries 40 years ago in a garage, turning it into a manufacturing empire now worth $300 million. We produce industrial components for construction, automotive, and aerospace industries across North America. My father was proud, stubborn, and absolutely convinced that his way was the only way. He had two daughters. Bethany, 28 years old, was beautiful, charming, and utterly incapable of doing anything that required actual work. Then there was me, Sloane, 32, the daughter who spent 10 years clawing her way up from junior analyst to vice president of operations, saving the company millions and keeping everything running, while Bethany posted selfies on social media and called it marketing. Growing up, the difference in how Dad treated us was painfully obvious. When Bethany turned 16, Dad bought her a cherry red convertible with a giant bow on top. When I turned 16, I got a card with $50 inside and a lecture about responsibility. Bethany lived in a luxury 2-bedroom apartment in the city that Dad paid for, complete with a doorman and a view of the river. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio with radiator heat that barely worked because I was paying my own rent on my junior analyst salary. Every family dinner, every company event, every conversation somehow centered around Bethany's latest accomplishment, which usually meant she'd managed to show up on time or remembered someone's name. Meanwhile, I was restructuring our entire supply chain, saving the company $12 million annually, but Dad would just nod absently when I mentioned it, then ask Bethany about her yoga class. I spent 10 years proving myself in that company. I negotiated contracts with suppliers in Taiwan, Mexico, and Germany, often working 16-hour days to accommodate time zones. I personally managed the crisis when our main facility flooded 3 years ago, coordinating repairs, relocating production, and ensuring we didn't miss a single delivery deadline. I implemented new quality control systems that reduced defect rates by 67%. I hired and trained department heads who turned struggling divisions into profit centers. The employees respected me because I knew their names, their jobs, and I fought for their raises and benefits. They tolerated Bethany because she was the boss daughter who occasionally wandered through the office in designer heels, patting people on the shoulder and calling everyone rock star without knowing what any of them actually did. Then 3 days ago, everything I'd built came crashing down. Dad called an emergency board meeting on a Tuesday morning. I walked in, expecting to discuss the quarterly reports I'd prepared, maybe talk about the expansion into the Canadian market I'd been researching. Instead, my father stood at the head of that mahogany table, looked directly at me, and announced he was retiring effective immediately. My heart actually jumped for a second, thinking maybe, finally, after all these years, he was going to recognize what I'd done for this company. Then he smiled at Bethany and said, "I'm naming Bethany as Chief Executive Officer. She's got fresh ideas and the charm to take Harper Industries into the future." The board members, mostly my father's old golf buddies, nodded and clapped politely. Bethany actually giggled and said, "Oh, Daddy, You're making me blush." Then Dad turned to me with what I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy and said I was being offered a generous severance package. 6 months' salary, effective immediately. Fired, just like that. 10 years of my life, gone because my sister needed a job title to match her apartment. Bethany looked at me with fake concern and said, "I really hope this doesn't affect our relationship as sisters, Sloan. I want us to still be close." I sat there watching her performance, watching the board members avoid my eyes, and something cold settled in my chest. Not sadness, not shock. Clarity. Because what none of them knew, what Dad had apparently completely forgotten in his rush to crown his princess, was that I held every single key to the actual operations of this company. The offshore accounts I'd set up for tax optimization, the supplier relationships that existed because of my personal reputation, the legal structures I'd created that only I fully understood. They thought they were firing an employee. They had no idea they were handing me a nuclear weapon. Let me take you back 5 years to explain exactly what leverage I'm talking about. Dad came to me one afternoon, closed the door to my office, and said he needed my help with something sensitive. The company was doing well, but we were paying a fortune in taxes, and he wanted to optimize our international operations. He asked if I could research legal ways to structure our overseas business more efficiently. I spent 6 months working with tax attorneys and international business consultants, and I created a network of entities that were completely legal but incredibly complex. We set up subsidiary companies in Ireland and Singapore for our international operations. We established accounts in Switzerland for currency management. We created legal structures that allowed us to move money efficiently between countries while staying completely within the law. Here's the critical part that Dad didn't understand because he never bothered to learn the details. All of those accounts, all of those legal entities, all of the banking relationships and supplier contracts associated with them were set up in my name. I had power of attorney for specific overseas transactions. I held the passwords, the account numbers, the contact information for every banker and lawyer involved. Dad signed papers I prepared because he trusted me, and because he was too proud to admit he didn't understand international corporate structures. He just wanted the tax savings, and I delivered them. $12 million in the first year alone. But in doing so, I'd become the only person who could actually access and manage approximately 40% of the company's operational capital. Bethany didn't even know these accounts existed. In her mind, being CEO meant attending charity galas, giving inspiring speeches she didn't write, and having her assistant bring her overpriced salads for lunch. Shed never bothered to learn how the business actually worked because Daddy always said she didn't need to worry about boring details. She had an MBA from a prestigious school that Dad's donations had helped her get into, but Shed never worked a real job in her life. Her internships were at companies where Dad's friends gave her made-up projects and glowing recommendations. She thought profit margins were something you discussed at cocktail parties, not something you fought for in tense negotiations at 3 a.m. with a factory manager in Monterey. I wasn't completely alone, though. Over the years, I'd built relationships with people in the company who saw through the Golden Child Act. Margaret Sullivan, our chief financial officer, was 55 years old and had been with the company for 20 years. She was brilliant with numbers and absolutely hated incompetence. Shed watched Bethany fail upward for years and had privately told me more than once that I should be running the company. Derek Reynolds headed our legal department. He was 42, sharp as a knife, and owed me a huge favor because I'd saved his job 2 years ago when he made a contract error that could have cost us millions. I'd found a solution and never told Dad it had been Derek's mistake in the first place. Then there was Yolanda Kim, our head of operations, 38 years old and someone I'd personally trained and promoted. She knew every system, every process, every detail of how we actually manufactured and delivered our products. The day after I was fired, I met Margaret at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. She looked exhausted and angry. Before I could even order, she started talking. Bethany had been CEO for exactly 1 day and had already made 3 catastrophic decisions. First, Shed canceled a contract with our main steel supplier because, and I quote, "I don't like their logo. It's not aesthetic." That supplier provided 30% of our raw materials at prices we'd negotiated over 5 years. Second, Shed announced plans to cut employee health benefits to fund a complete renovation of the executive floor, including a meditation room and a juice bar. Third, Shed scheduled a company-wide mandatory meeting for Friday afternoon to introduce her vision, which apparently involved everyone wearing branded Harper Industries athleisure wear she was having designed. Margaret just stared at me and said, "How long are you going to let this circus continue before you burn it down?" I told Margaret I wasn't going to burn anything down. I was just going to step back and let reality do the work for me. Because in 72 hours, major payments were due to our suppliers in Taiwan and Mexico. Those payments had to be authorized through the accounts only I could access. Without those payments, production would stop within a week. We'd default on contracts worth $30 million. Clients would walk. The company would start hemorrhaging money so fast that even Dad's board of cronies would have to notice. Margaret smiled for the first time in that conversation and asked what I needed from her. I told her to document everything Bethany did, every decision, every expense, every idiotic email. We were building a case, and when the time came, I wanted evidence that would be absolutely undeniable. Bethany's first full day as CEO was a masterpiece of incompetence. She arrived at 9:30. A full 90 minutes after the executive team meeting Shed scheduled, carrying a $5 coffee and apologizing with a giggle about traffic. Shed spent $70,000 of company money throwing herself a CEO celebration party in the main conference room the night before. There were ice sculptures, a champagne fountain, and a cake with her face on it. Every employee had been strongly encouraged to attend, which meant they all had to stay late, smiling through their exhaustion while Bethany gave a rambling speech about synergy and disruption and thinking outside the box. She used the word journey 14 times. I know, because Margaret counted. The speech was everything you'd expect from someone who'd never actually done the work. She talked about new visions and fresh perspectives without offering a single concrete idea. She announced changes that made no operational sense. We were going to rebrand with new company colors, teal and rose gold, because they tested well with millennials in some marketing survey Shed read about. We were implementing mandatory Fun Fridays where everyone had to participate in team-building activities Shed planned. She wanted to redesign the logo to be more modern and approachable. Not once did she mention profit, efficiency, client satisfaction, or any metric that actually mattered. The employees clapped politely because their jobs depended on it, but I heard from friends still at the office that the bathroom conversations afterward were brutal. The first real crisis hit on day 2. Gerald Foster, our head of manufacturing, was 60 years old and had been running our production facilities since before I was born. He was old school, gruff, and absolutely brilliant at keeping our lines running efficiently. He came to Bethany's office because one of our main assembly machines had broken down. This wasn't unusual. Industrial equipment breaks. We had maintenance budgets specifically for this. Gerald needed approval for $50,000 in emergency repairs. If we acted immediately, we could fix it over the weekend and be back to full production Monday. If we waited, we'd miss delivery deadlines for the Henderson contract, one of our biggest clients at $15 million annually. Bethany looked at the repair estimate like Gerald had asked her to donate a kidney. She said $50,000 was way too much money to spend on old machines. Gerald tried to explain that this wasn't optional, that production would stop, that we'd lose the Henderson contract. Bethany waved her hand dismissively and said she was sure it would be fine, that Gerald was being dramatic, and that she wanted him to just make do with what we had. She actually used the phrase make do about a 10-ton industrial press that required precision parts to function. Gerald left her office red-faced and furious. 2 hours later, the production line stopped completely. By end of day, we'd missed our first delivery deadline. Henderson Corporation's procurement director called, and Bethany took the call on speakerphone with her assistant present. The director was professional but firm. They had contracts with penalty clauses. If we couldn't deliver on schedule, they'd need to reconsider the relationship. That's when Bethany panicked. She called Dad, who was supposedly retired but apparently still on speed dial for emergencies. Dad told her to fix the machine immediately, whatever it cost. So Bethany authorized $200,000 in emergency repairs because she needed it done over a weekend with overtime crews and rush-ordered parts. Something that would have cost $50,000 if handled properly now cost 4 times that because of her incompetence. Word spread through the company instantly. The new CEO had turned a routine repair into a crisis and wasted $150,000 because she didn't understand basic manufacturing operations. People started updating their resumes. Dad called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail 3 times before finally answering. His voice was tight with stress. He asked if it'd help Bethany, just this once, just to get her through the learning curve. He said she needed guidance, that I knew the business better than anyone, that it would be good for the family. I let him finish his entire speech before I responded. Then I said, very calmly, that I didn't work there anymore. Head made that clear when he fired me. Head chosen Bethany for this role because he believed she was ready. I suggested he let her prove him right. Then I hung up. Margaret texted me 10 minutes later. Bethany had sent a company-wide email taking credit for solving the manufacturing crisis and promising that under her leadership, Harper Industries would reach new heights of excellence. The email had 17 typos and accidentally copied a personal text conversation with her boyfriend at the bottom. Our new CEO, everyone. What I didn't know yet was that Bethany's incompetence was just the opening act. The real threat came from someone I'd never suspected, someone who'd been at my father's side for 3 decades. Kenneth Bradshaw, who everyone called Ken, was 62 years old, silver-haired, and had been on Harper Industries' board since the beginning. He and Dad had played golf together every Saturday for 20 years. Dad called him his most trusted advisor. Ken had always been polite to me, professional, occasionally complimenting my work in board meetings. I'd never given him a second thought beyond basic respect for a senior board member. That was my mistake. Ken saw an opportunity in Bethany's appointment that I hadn't anticipated. He approached her privately during her second week as CEO, taking her to lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown. He told her she was doing an amazing job, that she had a vision her father never had, that she was exactly what the company needed. Bethany, who'd been drowning in problems she didn't understand and criticism from employees who barely respected her, soaked up the praise like a sponge. Ken told her the company was being held back by outdated thinking. The manufacturing division was old economy, low margin, and boring. What Harper Industries needed was to pivot to innovation and technology. He suggested she sell off the manufacturing assets to streamline the company and focus on the future. What Bethany didn't know, because she'd never bothered to understand the business, was that manufacturing was the company. We didn't have some separate innovation division waiting in the wings. We made industrial components. That was it. That was the entire business. Selling the manufacturing division would be like selling your engine because you wanted your car to be lighter. But Ken made it sound brilliant, visionary, transformative. He had a buyer ready, he said. A private equity firm that specialized in manufacturing acquisitions. They'd pay fair market value. And Bethany could use the cash to build something new and exciting. She'd be known as the CEO who revolutionized Harper Industries. Ken painted a picture of magazine covers and speaking engagements and respect from the business world. Bethany practically drooled. The reality, which I learned about from Margaret who'd overheard a phone conversation, was that the buyer was an investment firm run by Ken's nephew. They specialized in buying struggling companies, stripping the assets, selling everything for parts, and walking away with massive profits while leaving behind bankruptcy and unemployed workers. They'd done it to 4 companies in the past decade. Ken would get a finder's fee of several $1,000,000, plus whatever kickback his nephew promised him under the table. The firm would buy Harper Industries' manufacturing division for maybe half what it was worth, then immediately liquidate it. Our factories would close. 1,500 employees would lose their jobs. Suppliers we'd worked with for decades would be left with worthless contracts. The company my father built would be destroyed, and Ken would retire to his vacation home in Scottsdale with enough money to live like royalty. Bethany agreed to secret negotiations. Ken told her to keep it quiet because Dad wouldn't understand that this needed to be her decision as CEO. that she needed to prove she could lead without running to Daddy for approval. So she started having private meetings with Ken's nephew's team, signing preliminary documents, discussing timelines. Margaret found out because Bethany's assistant, a 23-year-old named Jenny who'd always liked me, felt something was wrong and copied Margaret on some emails. When Margaret showed me the documents, I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just about Bethany's incompetence anymore. This was corporate theft. This was Ken using my father's trust and my sister's stupidity to steal a $300 million company. I had a choice to make. Part of me wanted to let it all burn. Let Dad see what his golden child and his trusted friend were really capable of. Let them destroy everything and learn the hard way that I'd been the one holding it all together. But there were 1,500 employees who'd done nothing wrong except work hard and trust that their jobs were secure. There were suppliers, small businesses in some cases, who depended on our contracts to survive. And somewhere under all my anger, I still remembered the father who'd taught me about business over breakfast when I was 10 years old, before Bethany was born, when it was just Dad and me and Head called me his little partner. That company was his life's work, even if Head been too blind to see who was actually protecting it. Then Ken made it personal. Someone, I'm still not sure who, leaked to the business press that he'd been fired from Harper Industries for financial irregularities. The article was vague, just enough to plant suspicion without making specific accusations that could be sued over. It mentioned that Eid handled offshore accounts, and that there were questions about proper oversight. It was completely false, but the damage was immediate. I started getting calls from headhunters who'd been interested in recruiting me. Suddenly they were backing away, saying their clients had concerns, that they needed to wait until things settled. My professional reputation, built over 10 years of impeccable work, was being destroyed by rumor and innuendo, and my father didn't say a word in my defense. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't call to warn me or apologize. He was still protecting Bethany, even as she prepared to sell his company to vultures. 2 weeks into Bethany's reign as CEO, I got a call from my mother. Patricia Harper was 60 years old, a former beauty queen who'd married my father when she was 25 and spent the next 35 years perfecting the art of being quietly decorative. Shed never worked, never had to. Her job was to look good at company events, plan elegant dinner parties, and make sure Dad's life at home was comfortable and drama-free. Shed never been cruel to me, but Shed never protected me either. When Dad favored Bethany, Mom just smiled and said that was how fathers were with their babies. When I worked 100-hour weeks and came home exhausted, Shed suggested I try yoga and drink more water. Mom called to invite me to a family dinner at the house. She said it was important, that we needed to talk as a family, that too much distance had grown between us. Something in her voice felt off, but I agreed because I genuinely missed my mother, even if Shed never really been on my side. I showed up at 7 on a Tuesday evening, and the moment I walked into the dining room, I knew it'd been set up. Dad was there, which I expected. Bethany was there, smirking, which I also expected. But Ken Bradshaw was sitting at our family dinner table like he belonged there, and suddenly everything made sense. This wasn't a dinner. This was an ambush. We sat down, and Mom served salmon with asparagus like we were having a pleasant evening. Then Dad cleared his throat and pushed a folder across the table to me. Inside was a legal document, maybe 30 pages long, titled Consulting Services Agreement. Dad explained, in the tone he used when he thought he was being generous, that they wanted to bring me back in a limited capacity. I'd sign this agreement, transfer all access codes and passwords for the offshore accounts to the company, and provide documentation of all the legal structures I'd created. In exchange, they'd pay me $100,000 and drop any potential claims about my handling of company assets. Ken smiled at me and said it was a fair deal, that it would let everyone move forward. I started reading the contract while they watched. Bethany couldn't help herself. She leaned forward and said, "Come on, sis, don't be greedy. You've already got your severance. This is just cleaning up loose ends." She actually called 6 years of complex international corporate structuring loose ends. Then she added, "You were always so jealous of me. Dad made the right choice putting me in charge. I'm a natural leader. You're just good at details." I kept reading, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. Derek had trained me well. Always read every word of a contract, especially when someone's rushing you to sign. That's when I found it. Buried in Section 14, subsection C, there was language that said, by signing this agreement, I acknowledged that id acted outside the scope of my authority in creating the offshore structures, and that I was returning company property id improperly retained. It was carefully worded to sound like standard legal language, but what it actually did was admit to corporate theft. If I signed this, they could use it to file criminal charges against me. They could claim id stolen company assets, that id created these accounts to embezzle money, that the $100,000 was restitution. Ken had written this contract to destroy me. Mom chose that moment for her betrayal. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, her voice soft and disappointed. She said I was being selfish, that this was family business, and family came first. She asked why I couldn't just support my sister. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said I'd always been so aggressive, so unfeminine in how I approached business, that it wasn't attractive or appropriate. She said Bethany had grace and charm, qualities that mattered in leadership, and maybe if I'd focused more on being likable instead of being right all the time, Dad would have chosen differently. My own mother, sitting there in her designer dress in the house my career had helped pay for, telling me I wasn't good enough because I'd chosen competence over performance. Dad delivered the ultimatum. He said I needed to sign the agreement by the end of the week, or they'd sue me for theft of company property. He claimed I was withholding access to company accounts, that I was essentially holding the business hostage, and that they had grounds for criminal charges. He threatened to have me arrested. Ken nodded along, adding that they'd be very disappointed if it came to that, but they'd do what was necessary to protect the company. Bethany just smiled, probably already imagining the press release about how Shed recovered stolen assets from a disgruntled former employee. I closed the folder, pushed it back across the table, and did something they didn't expect. I laughed. The same laugh I'd given Dad when he fired me, genuine and knowing. I told them they were welcome to sue me. I had the best lawyers, and every single document proved I'd been authorized to create those structures. Every signature, every email, every board meeting minute showed that Dad had asked me to do this work and approved every step. I had power of attorney that Dad himself had signed. I'd committed no crime, and their contract was a transparent attempt to manufacture evidence of one. Then I looked at my father and said, "Did you forget who actually runs those accounts legally? Did you forget that you gave me that authority because you trusted me? Or did Ken convince you to throw that away like you threw me away?" I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out of that house while they sat there in stunned silence. I made it to my car before I started crying. Not because of Dad or Bethany. It expected nothing from them at this point. But Mom's words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Shed raised me. Shed been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every childhood milestone. And Shed just sat at that table and told me I wasn't good enough because I didn't perform femininity the way she thought I should. I drove home, barely seeing the road through my tears, pulled into my parking spot, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes trying to pull myself together. That's when someone knocked on my window and scared me half to death. It was Derek Reynolds, holding a bottle of wine and looking furious on my behalf. Derek told me Head quit that afternoon. Head submitted his resignation, effective immediately, and told the board exactly why. He said he wouldn't work for a company that treated its best people like disposable garbage while elevating incompetence and corruption. Head heard about the dinner through Margaret, who had sources everywhere. He came to my apartment to tell me that whatever I was planning, he was in. He had evidence of Ken's previous deals, connections to corporate lawyers who specialized in shareholder disputes, and a burning desire to watch them all realize what they'd done. We sat on my couch, drinking wine, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I didn't feel completely alone. I had allies, I had evidence, and I had a plan that was about to shift from defense to offense. Over the next 3 days, I assembled my team in my apartment like we were planning a heist. Derek brought his files on Ken's business history. Margaret brought financial documents Shed carefully copied before leaving the office each night, showing every expense Bethany had approved and every contract Shed mishandled. Yolanda brought operational data, proving that production was already falling behind schedule and quality metrics were dropping. Then there was Jackson Porter, our IT director, a 35-year-old genius who'd been quietly documenting everything happening on the company servers. Jackson had something that changed the entire game. Had been monitoring executive email accounts for security purposes, which was part of his job, and had found the email chain between Bethany and Ken's nephew's investment firm. The emails were damning. Bethany had agreed to sell the manufacturing division for $180 million, when independent valuations put it at $350 million. Shed waived due diligence periods. Shed agreed to indemnify the buyers against any undisclosed liabilities, which meant if anything went wrong after the sale, Harper Industries would be on the hook financially. Shed essentially agreed to every term they proposed without negotiation. Ken had been copied on several of these emails, offering Bethany advice that consistently favored the buyers. In one email, Head told her not to involve the company's lawyers because they'd just slow things down with unnecessary caution. In another, Head suggested she keep it quiet from the board until the deal was almost done so they couldn't interfere. But the real revelation was in Ken's own emails. Jackson had found communications between Ken and his nephew where they discussed their real plans. They were going to buy the manufacturing division, immediately close 2 of the 3 facilities, sell the equipment and real estate, and offshore the remaining production to a factory in Vietnam they already owned. They'd pocket approximately $200 million in profit. Ken's cut was $15 million plus a board seat in his nephew's holding company. They joked in the emails about Richard being too trusting and Bethany being too stupid to understand what she was signing. One email from Ken's nephew said, "It's like taking candy from the world's dumbest baby." They were laughing at my family while preparing to destroy 1,500 lives. I sat on my couch staring at these emails, and something cold and focused settled over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about stopping a crime in progress. We built a 3-phase plan. Phase 1 was to lock them out of the financial systems. I still had complete control over the offshore accounts that handled approximately 40% of operational capital. I'd change all the access codes and passwords, freeze any transfers that Ken and Bethany had been planning, and ensure that no money could move without my authorization. This was completely legal because I held power of attorney that Dad had never revoked. Phase 2 was to expose Ken to the board and shareholders. Derek would prepare a comprehensive evidence package showing Ken's conflict of interest, the undervalued sale price, and his nephew's history of corporate stripping. We'd contact the 3 honest board members who weren't Dad's golf buddies and schedule an emergency meeting. Phase 3 was to save the actual company by reaching out to suppliers and clients directly, using my personal relationships to guarantee that contracts would be honored and payments would be made. Monday morning, I executed Phase 1. At 8 a.m., from my laptop in a coffee shop, I logged into every offshore account and changed every password, security question, and access code. I set up new authentication requirements that sent confirmation texts to my phone. Then I sent a formal letter to our Swiss and Irish banks notifying them that I was exercising my power of attorney to freeze all transfers pending a governance review. The letter was perfectly legal, professionally written by Derek, and absolutely impossible for Bethany or Ken to override without a court order that would take weeks to get. By 9 a.m., Bethany arrived at the office to discover she couldn't access 40% of the company's money. She couldn't pay suppliers. She couldn't make payroll for the overseas staff. She couldn't authorize the wire transfer to Ken's nephew's firm that was supposed to happen that morning as a deposit on the manufacturing division sale. The panic was apparently immediate and spectacular. Bethany called an emergency meeting with the finance team, who had to explain to her what power of attorney meant and that no, they couldn't just override it because she was CEO. She tried to log into accounts she didn't know existed until that morning. She screamed at her assistant to get my father on the phone. She called Ken, who I imagine went pale when he realized his carefully planned theft had just hit a wall named Sloane Harper. According to Margaret, who was watching this unfold with barely concealed glee, Bethany's exact words were, How can my sister do this? Isn't this illegal? Can't we have her arrested? The corporate attorneys had to explain that not only was it legal, but trying to remove my authority would require proving I was acting against the company's interests, which would mean revealing the undervalued sale Ken had arranged, which would open a whole investigation they definitely didn't want. Ken tried to attack from a different angle. He called an emergency board meeting that afternoon and tried to paint me as a disgruntled former employee holding the company hostage. He presented it as a security crisis, saying I was interfering with normal business operations, that my access should have been revoked when I was terminated, that this proved I'd been planning something vindictive all along. 2 board members, both friends of Ken's, immediately called for legal action against me. They wanted to file suit for tortious interference and get a restraining order. One even suggested calling the police, though the company's lawyers had to explain that this was a civil matter and the police weren't going to arrest someone for using legal authority they'd been properly granted. Then Ken made his biggest mistake. He couldn't help himself. He told the board that I was clearly unstable, that he'd always been resentful of my sister's success, and that this was a personal vendetta. He suggested that perhaps I had mental health issues that should be considered. Derek, who'd been copied on the board meeting minutes through his ongoing connections, called me immediately. We'd known they'd try to discredit me, but having it happen still stung. That evening, Ken's people leaked a statement to the business press characterizing me as a disgruntled former executive engaging in unethical behavior. The headlines the next morning were brutal. My phone started ringing with former colleagues asking what was really going on, some believing the lies, others skeptical but confused. The personal attacks escalated. Bethany showed up at my apartment building that evening, buzzed my intercom 50 times when I wouldn't let her up, then screamed in the lobby until the doorman threatened to call the police. She yelled that I was destroying Dad's company, that I was jealous and pathetic, that everyone had always known I was bitter. She said I'd never been a team player, that I'd always thought I was smarter than everyone else, and that this proved Dad was right to choose her. She threatened to make sure I never worked in this industry again. I watched from my window as she finally got back in her car, and I felt nothing but pity. She still didn't understand what was happening. She thought this was a sibling rivalry. She had no idea she was a puppet in Ken's scheme. That night, my father called. His voice was different, harder and angrier than I'd ever heard it. He said I was blackmailing the family, that I was holding the company hostage for petty revenge, that had raised me better than this. He said that no matter what our differences, family came first, and what I was doing was unforgivable. He threatened lawsuits, criminal charges, public humiliation. He said I'd regret this for the rest of my life. I listened to his entire rant, and when he finally stopped for breath, I said very quietly, "You want access to those accounts? Fire Bethany. Fire Ken. Admit you were wrong." Then I hung up on my father for the second time in my life. He called back 17 times. I didn't answer. The war had truly begun. I thought I knew who my allies were. I thought I'd built my team carefully, choosing people I could trust absolutely. That's why what happened next hit me like a physical blow. Yolanda Kim, who I'd mentored for 5 years, who I'd promoted twice, who'd sat in my apartment 3 days earlier promising to help, betrayed me. I found out when Derek got a frantic call from Jackson in IT. Jackson had been monitoring data access like we'd discussed, and had noticed that someone had downloaded copies of all the documents we'd been compiling. Specifically, the evidence against Ken, the financial analysis of Bethany's mistakes, and the strategic plan we'd written for saving the company. The downloads had come from Yolanda's laptop at 2 in the morning. Derek called Yolanda immediately, pretending he needed to verify something. She was a terrible liar. Her voice went high and nervous, and she claimed she'd been doing research for her own records. Derek asked point blank if she'd been talking to Bethany, and there was a long silence before Yolanda said she had to go and hung up. Margaret did some digging and found out that Bethany had offered Yolanda the chief operating officer position plus a salary of $400,000 a year. Yolanda had 3 kids, a mortgage, and student loans. Bethany had found her price. The documents Yolanda stole included my analysis of which board members might support us, what evidence we had against Ken, and the timeline for our emergency shareholder meeting. Shed handed Bethany and Ken our entire playbook. The counterattack came faster than I expected. Ken's lawyers filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, claiming I'd set up the offshore accounts improperly and that my actions constituted theft and fraud. They used the documents Yolanda had stolen to show that I was planning to sabotage the company and that I was acting in conspiracy with Derek and Margaret. The judge who heard the motion was the Honorable Philip Crawford, and of course Head played golf with Ken for 20 years. Derek tried to argue that we needed more time to present our evidence, that the motion was based on false premises, but Judge Crawford wasn't interested. He granted a 72-hour temporary restraining order barring me from accessing any Harper Industries accounts or systems. 72 hours. 3 days during which I was completely locked out. The timing was catastrophic. We had major supplier payments due in 48 hours to factories in Taiwan and Mexico. These weren't optional payments. They were for materials already delivered and components already manufactured. Without those payments, the suppliers would halt all future shipments, which would stop our production within a week. We'd default on contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. The restraining order meant I couldn't authorize the payments, but Bethany didn't have the access to do it either because I'd changed all the codes. The company was about to collapse, and there was nothing I could do about it for 3 days. Ken thought Head won. According to Margaret, he was practically celebrating in the office. His plan was simple. Let the company start failing. Let suppliers pull out and clients cancel contracts, then position himself and Bethany as the saviors who'd clean up the mess by selling to his nephew at an even lower price because the company would be in distress. He'd get his $15 million. Bethany would avoid the blame by claiming I'd sabotaged everything, and my father would never know his best friend had destroyed him. It was actually brilliant in its cruelty. I sat in Derek's office trying to file appeals, but appeals take time we didn't have. The legal system moves at its own pace, and we had hours, not weeks. Margaret called with worse news. Bethany had started liquidating other assets to try to cover the shortfall. She was selling equipment, company vehicles, anything she could turn into quick cash. But she was doing it in a panic, taking lowball offers, burning value. The company was hemorrhaging money and credibility. Employees were being laid off. People who'd worked there for decades were getting termination notices because Bethany needed to cut costs immediately. Margaret was crying on the phone, something I'd never heard before, and she kept apologizing like this was her fault. Then the personal attacks reached a new level. Ken leaked selective documents to the business press that made it look like he'd been planning to steal the company all along. Headlines screamed about corporate espionage and family betrayal. A business news website published an article calling me a cautionary tale about giving too much power to ambitious junior executives. My LinkedIn was flooded with messages from people I'd never met telling me I was a disgrace. Former colleagues sent emails saying they were disappointed in me. Nobody wanted to hear my side because Ken's version was already everywhere. The final betrayal came from my father. He agreed to do a television interview with a local business news program. I watched it from my apartment, alone, with a glass of wine I didn't drink. The interviewer asked about the turmoil at Harper Industries, and Dad looked right into the camera with practiced sadness. He said that his daughter Sloane had always been troubled, that Shed struggled with mental health issues, that the family had tried to get her help but Shed refused. He said it broke his heart to see her acting out like this, but he wanted the public to know that they were doing everything they could to help her while protecting the company and its employees. He said it with such conviction, such apparent sincerity, that if I hadn't known better, I might have believed him myself. I turned off the television and just sat there. My father had publicly called me mentally ill to cover up his own mistakes and his friend's theft. My mother hadn't defended me. My sister was gleefully watching me burn. Yolanda had sold me out for money. I'd never felt more alone in my entire life. I actually started to wonder if I should just walk away, take what was left of my reputation, and start over somewhere else. Let them have the company. Let them destroy it. Let them learn the hard way. I was exhausted and heartbroken, and so tired of fighting people who should have loved me. That's when my doorbell rang at 11 o'clock at night. I almost didn't answer because I assumed it was another reporter or maybe Bethany coming to gloat. But I looked through the peephole and saw an old man I barely recognized. Chester Morrison was 80 years old, retired from the board 5 years ago, and had been my father's mentor when Dad was first starting the company. I hadn't seen Chester since his retirement party. He was standing in my hallway in a cardigan and slippers, looking ancient and determined. I opened the door, and he walked in without waiting for an invitation, looked at me with sharp blue eyes, and said, "Your father is a fool, and I'm here to help you fix this." Chester had been watching everything unfold from his retirement. He still got the board reports, still talked to people in the company, still cared about the business Head helped build. He told me he knew Ken was a snake, that Head warned my father about him years ago, but Richard never listened. Head seen the press coverage, done his own research, and figured out what was really happening. He said he still owned 12% of the company's stock from his founder's shares, and while Head been passive for years, he could call an emergency shareholder meeting. The judge's restraining order couldn't stop shareholders from voting. We had 24 hours to reach enough other minority shareholders to get 51% of the vote. If we could do that, we could remove Bethany and Ken, install new leadership, and I could authorize the supplier payments before the company collapsed completely. I stared at this 80-year-old man who'd driven across town at night in his slippers to save me, and something fierce and grateful rose up in my chest. I called Derek and Margaret. They came to my apartment immediately. Jackson joined us remotely. We had one day to save everything, and this time, we weren't going to lose. The next 24 hours were the most intense of my life. We divided up the shareholder list and started making calls. Harper Industries had minority shareholders scattered across the country. Some were employees who'd been given stock as bonuses over the years. Others were early investors who'd believed in Dad when the company was just starting. We needed to convince enough of them to show up or send proxy votes to get us to 51%. Derek handled the legal side, making sure every proxy was properly documented. Margaret worked the financial angle, showing shareholders that Bethany's leadership would bankrupt them. Jackson provided data on the company's declining performance, and I made the personal calls, reminding people of who I was and what I'd done for the company they'd invested in. Some people hung up on me. They'd seen the news coverage, heard my father's interview, and thought I was exactly what Ken said I was. But others listened. Thomas Gilbert, who'd worked in quality control for 30 years and owned 0.3% of the stock, remembered when I'd saved his department from being outsourced. He said He'd be there. Francine Palmer, who'd been Dad's bookkeeper in the early days and still held 2%, said she'd never trusted Ken and would vote however I needed. One by one, we built our coalition. It was exhausting and terrifying because we wouldn't know if we had enough until the actual meeting. And we were fighting against the clock and against Ken's, people who were making their own calls trying to lock down votes. The shareholder meeting was held at a hotel conference room because Chester insisted on neutral ground. We scheduled it for 4 p.m., which gave us until the last possible minute to gather votes. I arrived early with Derek, Margaret, and Jackson. Chester was already there, looking like a distinguished grandfather in a three-piece suit that probably cost more than my car. Then Dad and Bethany arrived with Ken, a team of lawyers, and their loyal board members. Bethany looked nervous for the first time, which gave me a small amount of satisfaction. Ken looked angry and calculating. Dad looked confused and diminished, like he couldn't quite understand how his world had gotten so far out of his control. The press was outside because Chester had tipped them off. He wanted this public, wanted everything to happen in the light where Ken couldn't manipulate things behind the scenes. Shareholders filed in, about 60 people in total, representing various amounts of stock. The room was tense and silent except for whispered conversations. A corporate attorney Chester had hired served as moderator to keep everything legitimate and by the book. At exactly 4 p.m., the meeting was called to order. Dad stood up immediately and objected, claiming the meeting was illegitimate, that Chester didn't have the authority to call it, that this was a hostile takeover attempt by a disgruntled former employee. Ken's lawyers jumped in with parliamentary objections and procedural challenges. But Derek had prepared for this. He calmly cited the corporate bylaws, the shareholder agreement, and Delaware corporate law. Chester had every right to call this meeting. The votes would proceed. The moderator sided with us. Dad sat down looking furious and lost. Then it was my turn. I stood in front of 60 people who held my future in their hands, and I presented our case. I didn't lead with emotion or accusations. I led with evidence. I showed them the emails Jackson had found proving Ken's scheme. I showed them the financial analysis proving Bethany had cost the company $43 million in 3 weeks. I showed them the sale agreement that would have sold their investment for half its value. I presented documentation of every contribution it made to the company over 10 years, every success, every crisis it managed, every dollar it saved or earned. I showed them projected financials under current leadership, which led to bankruptcy within 6 months, versus my plan for returning to profitability within 18 months. I kept my voice calm and professional even though my hands were shaking. I said I wasn't there for revenge or personal vindication. I was there because 1,500 employees deserved better than to be pawns in Ken's scheme, because shareholders deserved leadership that would protect their investment, because the company my father built from nothing deserved to survive and thrive. I said I understood if they didn't trust me after everything they'd heard, but I asked them to look at the evidence and make their decision based on facts, not fear or loyalty or manipulation. Then I sat down, and Dad got his turn. He stood up and gave an emotional speech about family and loyalty and how painful it was to see his daughter attacking her own sister. He defended Bethany, saying she just needed time to learn, that everyone deserved a chance, that I was being impatient and vindictive. He talked about building the company with his own hands and how Head always trusted Ken's wisdom. He talked about everything except the actual evidence of theft and incompetence Wed presented. It was all feelings and history and appeals to tradition. When he said, "She's my daughter and she deserves this chance," I felt something crack inside me. I stood up, interrupting, which wasn't technically allowed, but I didn't care anymore. I looked at my father and said, "So am I, Dad. I'm your daughter too. Why didn't I deserve a chance? Why didn't I deserve your trust after 10 years of proving myself?" The room went absolutely silent. Dad stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, and for the first time in this whole nightmare, he had no answer, no justification, no excuse, just silence. Then I sat back down, and the moderator called for votes. The tension in that room was unbearable as the ballots were collected and counted. It took 30 minutes that felt like 30 hours. Bethany kept whispering to Ken. Dad sat with his head in his hands. I held Derek's hand under the table and tried to breathe. Finally, the moderator stood and read the results. Motion to remove Bethany Harper as CEO, 54% in favor. Motion to remove Kenneth Bradshaw from the board of directors, 67% in favor. Motion to appoint Sloan Harper as chief executive officer, 56% in favor, with some abstentions from people who voted for removal but weren't ready to support me yet. Wed won. Barely, but Wed won. Bethany's reaction was immediate and spectacular. She started screaming that this wasn't fair, that they couldn't do this to her, that Dad had promised her this job. She grabbed papers from the table and threw them, actually threw them like a toddler having a tantrum. She yelled that I was a thief and a liar and that everyone would regret this. Security had to escort her out while she was still screaming. Mom went with her, shooting me a look of such disappointment and anger that it actually hurt. But Id won, so the pain was bearable. Ken tried one last move. He stood up and announced that he'd be filing criminal charges against me for fraud and embezzlement, that his lawyers would pursue this to the fullest extent of the law. Derek stood up smoothly and announced that Wed already filed a countersuit against Ken for breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and conspiracy to commit fraud, and that Wed be referring the matter to the SEC and the FBI for investigation of corporate fraud. Ken's lawyers immediately pulled him aside and started whispering urgently. Within 5 minutes, Ken and his legal team left the building. I found out later that they'd advised him to settle quietly and hope the evidence didn't lead to actual criminal charges. Head lost, and he knew it. The room slowly emptied until it was just Dad, Chester, Derek, Margaret, Jackson, and me. Dad sat alone at the big conference table, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I walked over and stood in front of him. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I just wanted to give her something. She's not like you, she's not strong." The admission hung in the air between us. I said, "So you punished me for being strong? You threw me away because I didn't need you?" He didn't answer, just looked down at his hands. I took a breath and said, "When you're ready to apologize, really apologize, call me. Until then, I have a company to save." Then I walked away from my father, and this time, I didn't look back. 3 months later, I was sitting in the CEO's office that used to be my father's, looking at financial reports that actually made me smile. WED stabilized the company. Id personally called every major supplier and client, explained what had happened, and guaranteed that Harper Industries was back under competent leadership. Most of them gave us another chance because they'd worked with me for years and trusted my word. Id brought back the employees Bethany had laid off and given them back pay for the time they'd lost. Id promoted Margaret to Chief Operating Officer, Derek to General Counsel, and Jackson to Vice President of Technology. We were building a leadership team based on merit and competence, not family connections or politics. The work was exhausting. I was pulling 70-hour weeks, managing crises, rebuilding relationships, and proving every single day that the shareholders had made the right choice, but it was fulfilling in a way the old job never was because now I had the authority to actually fix things instead of just managing around Bethany's incompetence. The stock price was recovering. WED won back 2 clients who'd left during the chaos. Production was back on schedule. Slowly, painfully, we were healing. Personally, I was also healing, though that process was harder. Id started seeing a therapist to work through the family trauma and the realization that Id spent my entire adult life seeking approval from someone who was never going to give it. My therapist helped me understand that my father's inability to see my worth wasn't actually about me. It was about his own issues, his need to feel needed, his ego that couldn't handle a daughter who succeeded without his constant guidance. Bethany had always needed him, always relied on him, and that made him feel important. I'd been independent and capable, which somehow threatened him. Understanding that didn't make it hurt less, but it helped me stop blaming myself. Bethany tried to start a consulting business called Harper Leadership Solutions. It failed within 2 months when she realized that nobody was going to pay her to tell them how to run a company she'd nearly destroyed in 3 weeks. Last I heard, she was living off a trust fund Dad had set up for her years ago, posting inspirational quotes on social media about overcoming adversity and betrayal, making herself the victim in a story where she'd been the villain. I'd blocked her on all platforms and moved on with my life. My relationship with my mother went through a strange evolution. 6 months after the shareholder meeting, she called and asked to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but curiosity won. We met at a cafe, and it was incredibly awkward until Mom finally said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She admitted that she'd always known I was the capable one, the smart one, the one who'd actually earned everything. But she said that's why she'd never worried about me, never defended me, because she knew I'd be fine. She'd focused her attention on Bethany because Bethany needed it. It was twisted logic and a terrible excuse for years of emotional neglect, but it was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get from her. She also told me that Dad was different now, diminished somehow. Losing the company, seeing Ken's betrayal, watching Bethany's spectacular failure, it had broken something in him. I felt pity when she said that, but not enough to reach out. Dad never apologized. He moved to a condo in Boca Raton and spent his days playing golf and pretending he'd retired by choice, rather than being forced out. He sent occasional emails about business, offering advice I didn't ask for and didn't need. I didn't respond. Some people said I was being cruel, that he was my father and I should forgive him, but they didn't understand that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting toxic behavior back into your life. I'd made peace with never getting closure from him. Had chosen Bethany over and over, and now had have to live with the consequences of that choice. Some parents simply cannot admit their mistakes, and that's their burden to carry, not mine. The lesson I learned through all of this came in layers. First, I learned that you cannot earn love from people who are determined not to give it. I'd spent 10 years working myself to exhaustion, achieving more than most people do in entire careers, and it was never enough for my father because the problem wasn't my performance. The problem was his inability to value strength in a daughter when he needed her to need him. Second, I learned that toxic families will punish you for being strong. They'll call you aggressive, unfeminine, difficult, or ambitious, like it's a dirty word. They'll give opportunities to people who don't deserve them and take credit away from people who do. And they'll expect you to smile through it all in the name of family loyalty. But here's the truth about revenge that nobody tells you until you've lived it. Yes, I won. I got the company. I proved I was right. I exposed the people who'd tried to destroy me. But it was empty in ways I didn't expect. I lost my family. And some days, that still hurts more than I want to admit. My father and I will probably never speak again beyond brief, cold emails. My mother and I have coffee twice a year and make small talk like acquaintances. My sister genuinely hates me. Those losses are real and permanent, and no amount of professional success fills that specific hole. So, if you're facing something similar, here's my advice. Ask yourself what you're really fighting for. If it's recognition from people who will never give it, walk away. Seriously. Just walk away. You'll save yourself years of pain and disappointment. Some people are incapable of seeing your value, and that's a them problem, not a you problem. But if you're fighting to protect something bigger than yourself, something you built, something that matters beyond personal vindication, then fight like hell. Fight smart, fight with evidence, fight with allies, and don't stop until you win. I'm dating someone now. His name is Graham Foster. He's 40 years old, an architect with his own firm, and he has absolutely no connection to my business world. We met at an art gallery opening that Margaret dragged me to when she decided I needed a social life. Graham knows about everything that happened, and he doesn't treat me like I'm damaged or impressive or anything other than myself. It's the healthiest relationship I've ever had, because it's not built on proving anything or earning approval. It's just two people who enjoy each other's company. I've also reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with during my workhorse years. I've built a chosen family with my team at work, people who celebrate my strength instead of punishing me for it. That day in Dad's office when he fired me and I laughed, I knew something he didn't. I knew I didn't need his permission to be powerful. I already was. I'd built the infrastructure that ran his company. I'd created the relationships that sustained it. I'd developed the skills that could save it or let it burn. The power had been mine all along, and his failure to recognize that was his loss, not mine. Now I run the company better than he ever did because I promote based on merit, I listen to my team, and I don't let ego or favoritism cloud my judgment. To everyone watching this who's fighting for scraps of love from people who can't see your worth, please hear me. You are not the problem. Your competence is not a flaw. Your strength is not unfeminine or threatening or something you need to apologize for. Build your own table. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your achievements instead of diminishing them. Find mentors who want you to succeed, not family members who need you to fail so they can feel superior. And when those people who undervalued you finally realize what they lost, you'll be too busy thriving to care. My father calls sometimes now. I see his name on my phone, and I have a choice to make. Some days I answer and we have brief, surface-level conversations about nothing important. Some days I don't answer because I'm not ready and maybe never will be. Today, his name popped up on my screen while I was reviewing expansion plans for our new facility in Texas. I stared at it for 3 rings, then let it go to voicemail. Maybe someday I'll be ready for whatever conversation he wants to have. Maybe I'll never be ready. But that's my choice now, not his. Today, I have a company to run, employees who depend on me, and a life I'm building on my own terms. And honestly, that's more than enough. So I want to hear from all of you. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Have you had to fight for recognition from people who should have given it freely? Drop your stories in the comments because I guarantee you're not alone in this. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you or if you're rooting for everyone out there who's still fighting to prove themselves to people who'll never appreciate them. Subscribe to this channel because we share real stories about real struggles. And sometimes knowing other people have survived what you're going through makes all the difference. And please share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by whether their family recognizes it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so full and successful that you genuinely stop caring what they think. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope wherever you are, whatever you're fighting for, you find the courage to stand up for yourself and the wisdom to know when to walk away. You deserve people who celebrate your strength, not resent it. Go build that life. And don't look back.